breakout rooms, those will not be recorded. So, if you wish to remain anonymous on the recording, there are ways of doing that. So Neil, thank you very much. And just one other thing to say by way of thanks, that Neil is happy for the slides, which will be shown this morning, to be shared. And I'll hand over to Neil with that. Thank you very much, Neil.
Thank you, Tony, and good morning. How lovely to see you all, watching you all on Gallery View and just getting a sense of who you are. I wonder, just while I introduce myself, whether on the chat facility you just jot your name and the church that you ministering at, or the circuit, or your context, and perhaps give me some idea of the size of your worshiping community. It just helps me to have a sense of your context, just very, very bluntly, really. For myself, you may have come across, sure you may well have heard of LICC, and some of you I know may have come across us in more detail. I worked with LICC pretty much full-time, 4 days a week, for 13 years, up to the end of last year. At which point I continued my relationship with LICC, but more as an adjunct member of the team, and went back into local church ministry. So having spent, this is of no interest to you, but it's quite important to me. The first 10 years of my working life in local church, I then did a dozen years in a theological college, and then 13 with LICC, and then went back in. So I'm back in local church pastoral ministry full time for the first time in 25 years, which I think my church now are recognizing. That I'm kind of learning again what it looks like in a new context. My church, just to give you a context for it, is probably a similar size to some of yours. We have about 180 folks worshiping with us across the ages. And we've seen that church grow from being a small church of about 30 people to where we are today. And so I know both the joy and the challenge of churches as they grow in over time. And of course, now we're at the size we are. Sometimes I look back at when we were 30 and go, gosh, I wish we just had 30 again. And then I remember the days when there were just 30 of us, and me just desperately praying, oh God, send us people, anybody. And sometimes doing that big promise of we'll be whatever you want us to be if you'll stay. But recognizing now where we are now, the complexity of leading a medium to larger sized church. And the way I see it is the complexity. There's numbers of complexity. I don't need to go into that with you because you know your own. But the two that I'm particularly aware of at the moment is there's an organizational complexity of ensuring that what lies in your heart about ministry and your vision for ministry is actually shared across the teams of people that you minister alongside. And that is, that slows things down, because actually, although you might be very clear about what you think the purpose of the church is and have quite a strong ecclesiology in your theology and your practice, actually ensuring that that's shared is not an easy task. I'm sure you'll agree. So that's one of the complexities. And that, in a sense, for myself, means that I've got to go at an appropriate pace to make changes that I think are necessary for us to keep on being renewed according to what we think God's called us to be. And that's the first one. The second complexity is that my experience has been that when you look a little bit more, when we were 30 people, not many people wanted to join us because we just looked like we were dying on our feet, and some days it felt like it. But suddenly you become a little bit more, outwardly it looks a little more, I'm going to use the word successful, and people are more eager to join you. But the people who join you then come with their own expectations, and the danger and sometimes the problem I've had, there's not been people who find faith. Those are brilliant. It's people who come with from other churches. particularly when they come then with criticism of their previous church, but they want to actually reintroduce their previous church into the present church. And the competing understanding of what it means to be church. And so I hope, you know, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, I know that, but I hope that together as we explore what it means to lead a whole life disciple-making church, that actually some of these issues might be helpful. I'm going to share a screen so you've got some slides. And as Tony said, we'll make these slides available if you wish. So just to emphasize what I want to do this morning and how I want to do it. This morning really is about the culture and the posture of a leader. I'm convinced that one of the tasks I have as someone who feels called to lead, literally lead a whole life disciple-making church, I feel it's a calling, is to have a certain posture as a leader, to see ministry in a certain way, and then to act out of that. And that means that sometimes I have to do things or minister in ways that are not necessarily the ways that people would expect me to minister. And it's knowing how I can do that. And the way I want to do that this morning is, in the 90 minutes we have, is to do a mixture of input and then breakout room, input, breakout room, and then reflection. So that's where we're going to go this morning. LICC are known for two things, and both of them are linked and both of them are significant. We are called as LICC to empower Christians to make a difference in God's world, and we're called to empower church leaders to help them do that. And I think that first one is the calling as a local leader, that our task as church together is to empower one another to make a difference in the world that God has called us to live in. If you've ever come across LICC at all, you will recognize this next picture, although it may be not in the shape, not in the direction that you remember it. But this is a diagram we often will use. The red dots represent roughly the percentage of people who gather for Christian worship once a month or more in the UK. It's a very, very rough figure, and it's a very difficult figure actually to get accurate numbers on. But let's go for around 6%. 94% of people doesn't really say anything about what they believe or indeed practice. We know that a lot of people will hold to some form of Christian belief. We know that a lot more people will pray. But I'm kind of interested in the gathering of people who say, actually, because of the resurrection of Jesus, because of our understanding of the gospel, we gather together, at least we're committed to gathering together at least once a month or more. These minority communities that we call church need to be passionate, expectant, faith-filled, and faithful. That's not news, is it? But in a context where the regular gathering of Christians together is now minority, the sense of the significance of that, I think, increases. For all sorts of reasons, I've been reminded over and over again recently in preaching and in reading the sense of the significance of the resurrection of Jesus and his lordship over every area of life. And so one of the reason I start here is because as a church minister, if I'm going to try and empower Christians, my congregation, to make a difference in God's world, unless we are a gathered group of people who are passionately committed to the resurrection of Jesus, belief in the resurrection of Jesus and the implication of that, then actually what we will do is simply encourage activism. Or worse than that, we'll send people out without the spiritual resources to actually engage in the mission of God. However, when they are scattered, people are called to live counterculturally. And they're scattered all over in all sorts of different places. And they live counterculturally in a number of ways. Firstly, because they are seeking to live as disciples of Jesus there. And I'll define that in a moment. But if you think simply about such a simple act of worship we engage with together as the Lord's Prayer, once people begin praying the Lord's Prayer together, they are verbally, publicly declaring a completely different vision of the world. The moment you pray that the kingdom will come, you declare a different way of looking at the world. The moment you ask for the Father to establish the kingdom, you declare a different, not only a different vision, a different telos for the whole world, but actually what you do is you also declare a different means of what does the good life look like. Once you talk about, once you ask God to give you the daily bread, your daily provision, you recognize a whole different economic means of sustenance. Once you pray that you won't be led into temptation, once you pray for deliverance from sin and from evil and for forgiveness, then actually you face a different view of reality. And again, this is obvious. But when we encourage people to pray the Lord's Prayer together, what we are telling them is to remind themselves of what it looks like to be red in a sea of, in the slide, white. We're different. We see the world differently. And it's not a judgment on everybody else. It's actually to say, this is what it means to live out this gospel that you've been invited to be part of in the midst of your world. We use the language of discipleship, and of course, once you start using it, you need some sort of means of defining it. And the definition that I often will use is my own, but it's this: it's no better or worse than others, and there's much that could be said. But a disciple is, at the least, someone who's learning to live the way of Jesus in their context at this moment. Learning to live the way of Jesus in their context at this moment. It's not static, it's contextual. You have to learn this way of Jesus. It's not automatic. It's new because the moments keep changing, and it's missional. And I think that my task as someone who has responsibility for ministering and serving a church is to enable everybody who's part of that church community to understand that that's, in part at least, what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. This is normal. And you and I both know that for some people, discipleship is like a word that's used simply for keen people, for the keenism. It's like, you know, for some people, it's like A-level Christianity, whereas they just think they're GCSE types. I'm just a Christian. I'm just an ordinary Christian. And disciples, well, they're the really keen ones. And of course, I want to keep on reminding them, no, not at all. This is a definition of what it means to be part of the kingdom, to be connected with God through Christ, to be filled with the Spirit, and to live that life out. Doesn't mean to say we get it all right, but it does mean we're in a context where we're learning. But on the whole, we believe that 98% of Christians have neither been envisioned nor equipped for mission in 95% of their waking lives. That's the barrier. I would want to, I mean, this is a sort of a general slide that we use. I would want to say that actually, where, you know, if I look back over my own ministry, I think I've really tried hard to envision people for mission in the whole of their life. But I think when I look back, where the failure was often was in equipping them. So I think I was good on motivation. I wasn't always good on creating a context in which people would learn the answer to the question, how? And I look back sometimes on this, and this may be too personal to be helpful, but I look back and I think, I remember the sermons and the teaching and the encouragement I gave, and it was very much in the motivation mode. And it could have been interpreted by people as, what you think I lack is enthusiasm or the desire. Whereas I think what people were sitting there going, I don't like that. I don't know how to do it. Show me how it works in my context. Because what they could see is how it might work in the church context, on my turf, if you will. But what they were struggling with is what it would look like in theirs. Well, like you, we've been ministering in a crisis, and I think the things we've learned in ministry, or at least the things we've been challenged to learn in ministry in crisis, might actually be the things that need to lie behind ministry when we, and who knows what new normal will look like, but you know, when we're doing it much more in person. During these last few months, this has been our experience, anyway, my experience. What I've had to think through is, how do you stay connected to people when you can't meet in person, when they are physically distanced? Now, this is obvious, isn't it? And that's why we all became almost overnight sort of technological geniuses, or just fearful people. But what we recognized really quickly in that weekend in March, around the 20th, where we had about 3 days to prepare, was we're going to have to stay connected to people when they can't come to us. And if you think back over what we've done over the last 3 months, most of us have been wrestling with that question: how do you connect when people are scattered? Up till the 20th of March or thereabouts, we just were able to assume they would come to us. And then we would simply go looking for the ones who didn't come to us. But now it was, how do you stay connected with everybody? The second thing we've had to think about is, what does it mean to equip people to live faithfully for Christ when they're scattered? And it's been really interesting to see what churches have done about how do you equip people to maintain the vitality of a spiritual life when they can't come together. And so you have churches who offer daily prayer online. You have people who, you know, at 7:30 in the morning have 5 minutes where they gather people, or at lunchtime or whatever. There's a whole plethora of ways, and you've probably done your own thing. But what you've done is you've tried to think, actually, how do I equip people for this context? And it may be, I mean, it will have happened either through your preaching, because your preaching will now have been in the context of, well, how do you equip people to deal with the situation they're facing? It's obvious. But we've had to think about that. And then 2 more. We've tried to understand their context. So we've worked with the people we have and their the context that they have. So I know churches who go, well, actually, for most of my people, they're not able to access Wi-Fi. So therefore, the way we communicate with them has to take that into account. Or they are juggling, working from home, educating children, and you know, dealing with that. And goodness, I'm really glad my kids have grown up and left home, because I don't know if, do you know, I don't know who would have been still alive at this point in our household. But you've got other people then who are completely isolated for a long period of time. Those people who've been shielded. And then you've got the people who are on furlough, who, some of whom are actually out of work now, but they don't know it yet. And you've been ministering, even with those very rough 3-stage groups of people, and you've kept that context in mind, because if you're like me, because you learn by accident or by feedback that if you just talked about lockdown as being this time where you had lots of time on your hands, someone would say, actually, not for me. And that made you alert to context. And then finally, you've responded creatively. You've learned new skills and you've taught other people how to learn skills. I don't know about you, but before all this happened, I had used Zoom, but suddenly I was the only, it was like in the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed man is definitely king. I'd used it a few times before and I now was the expert, teaching other people how to use the sort of the technology in order that they could connect. So in other words, I responded creatively to the context that people were in, and I taught them how to access it. Now, I hope that hasn't sort of been annoyingly obvious, but what I want to say is I think that's the task of ministry at all times. At all times. How do we connect when people are scattered? How do we equip them for what they need? How do we understand their context? And how do we respond creatively? Now, the brilliant thing is we can do this because for 3 months we've been doing it. So it's not like this is beyond the wit that we have. It's just actually knowing that what we've just encountered is what we need to do on an ongoing basis. Now, in a sense, one of the good things that's come out of this situation is that it accelerated some things that it might have taken us a long time to persuade people to do. Can you imagine trying to persuade people to do small groups on Zoom before they had to stay at home? It would be like, oh, it's not going to work. I can't make my telly work. Whereas actually what we've done is we've accelerated it. But the principles are there. I want to say one last thing, and then I'm going to give you a chance to reflect on some of this. There are times during this virus situation where the challenge of keeping the balance between the gathered and the scattered church. So what do we do together, and how do we equip people for their scattered lives? I have felt has been put under, for me, has been put under some tension. And one of the questions that the EA sent round a survey recently, and they may well have sent it on to you, and you may have participated as I did, was how has your church responded to the COVID situation? Now, I'm conscious of the pictures I see in my echo chamber of Facebook of church worshipping areas that are full of food that's being distributed to hundreds of people in their communities, etc., etc., etc. And we don't do that. And it can feel like, well, what are you playing at then as a church? And I read someone's response to what has your church been doing during the COVID crisis. And this is what they said. Our church has been teaching the children of essential workers and those who are the most vulnerable in our society. Our church has been caring in care homes for those who are completely isolated and very fearful. Our church has been nursing people on the wards, learning new skills under immense pressure. Our church has been working in GP surgeries under new conditions, trying to help patients over the phone. Our church has been working in warehouses, working for the big factories, and suddenly they are now essential workers, ensuring that the food gets to people's plates. Our church has been working on production lines. Our church has been neighbours, going to the shops for those who live around them. Our church has been volunteering with the NHS. Our church has been working from home. Our church has been educating their kids. Our church has been working in food banks. Our church has been shielding themselves for their own sake and the sake of wider society. I find that really helpful because it's easy to snap back into, well, what's your church doing? And what they mean is, what are you doing as a gathered church, rather than recognizing what the scattered church are doing, and therefore how you are ministering to those lives in a scattered context. I want to ask then these questions and give you a chance in a breakout room for you to engage with them. Now, I think it's difficult for us to show this slide in all the breakout rooms, so you might just want to scribble these questions down so that when you get in the breakout rooms, you can remember why you're there. The first is, what helps you stay focused on the scattered lives of your congregation? What's been the greatest challenge? And what's helped you face that challenge? And what I would suggest is when you get into your breakout room, and we're just going to, I think we're aiming to get you in a group of about 4 people. So this isn't going to be it's not going to be difficult to organize yourselves. But could one of you just sort of ensure that you move yourself through? You've got about 5 minutes on each really, but just make sure you move through each of those questions so that by the time 15 minutes is up, you feel like you've been able to hear one another on that. And then when we give you the sort of 60-second we're going to pull you out of this room warning, can you in that minute just allow one person from your group to say, this was the most significant thing in our conversation? In other words, I don't want you to repeat everything that's said, but what's been the most significant thing that as a group you feel has been said or heard in your conversation? Is that okay? So hopefully you've had a chance to get those down, and David is going to ensure that you end up in a small group, and when you get there, you will go, I am so glad to be with you.
Emma, that was too quick.
Don't blame me, blame Neil.
Yeah, it's like, can we tell the guest speaker, can we just go back into our breakout room? It's far better without him. Thanks, Patrick, for that vote of confidence. So I wonder whether, very quickly, can some of you give me some idea about the significant things that were being shared in your conversation, just very briefly? Yeah, Mark Hammond.
I'll get in quick because we didn't really get beyond the first question. We were very ill-disciplined, but what we all seemed to share in common was, whilst we've been trying to do the LICC thing for years, all of a sudden we're able to do it. It happens that our focus necessarily is on where people are, but the challenge is with it that it's come at the same time as I suppose a homogenization of the categories that people fall into, which you set out very well earlier.
Yeah.
And a disengagement from us personally from those individuals in those categories, which means, you know, many of us share the same experience of me, that I spend all my time communicating in this room to this camera, to these notional people. Meanwhile, from the feedback we're getting back, the church is looking after itself very well, actually without that personal engagement with us.
Okay, that's all it took was a global pandemic. That's a really interesting reflection, and we might want to come back to that. Does somebody else want to reflect on the comments? Thanks, Mark. Yeah, Rob. Nice to see you, Rob.
Hi. Well, unlike Mark, we were very disciplined, got through all 3 questions, but lots of different things happening. And I think for some people, the greatest challenge was when they themselves had a health issue that meant that they had to isolate, making that decision, are you going to take any of the funerals or none? And making that decision to take none of the funerals themselves, that was a really challenging thing, you know, pastorally, to that decision, making that decision. Creatively, I think a whole variety of things that are being done, and it's probably pushed things forward, the pandemic, in that digitally with the websites, etc., we're now creatively doing things that probably we should have been doing anyway. So I think that was also part of it. I think generally when people struggle to get on the internet with emails or whatever, we're all finding it really quite a challenge to engage with the elderly vulnerable. And so we're all conscious of that, but not really getting our heads around it particularly. And that's one more challenge for us at the moment. But yeah, so lots of positives, but the tension between keeping the show on the road and discipleship. So there is a lot happening now, people in their work environment as nurses with all the gear on, sharing a testimony in an act of worship. So I think there's more of that now happening, but just keeping the show on the road with a busy circuit, superintendency, and colleagues who are not always that helpful at times can be quite challenging for some of us anyway.
Thanks, Rob. Somebody else, does somebody else want to reflect? Particularly if you had other things. Sean is there.
Yes, in our group we were quite disciplined. We got to 2.5.
I really appreciate you just loading the guilt on Mark.
Well, I was better than Mark, but not as good as Rob. Okay. Yeah, we were reflecting quite a lot of commonality between us in the sense that we were focused on addressing what you said out before quite well, the sort of mixed economy of people, those who can engage with online stuff and those who can't. And the almost delight of being able to focus on stuff that we haven't been able to do in the past. It's been in the long grass. We know it's been important, but the whole online and digital communication stuff. In fact, one of us was talking about a post being created at present for somebody who has particular skills in that respect. The challenges have been sort of the tensions between those who can't wait to get back to normal and those who sort of feel this is a liminal moment where we've got an opportunity to do something, that we know is coming eventually for the church anyway, a lot of us in leadership, and actually this has forced that long grass conversation into the future, into the present. And the third thing about what's helped us often has been the colleagueship and being able to bounce things off each other.
Great. Can I just take one more? I think there might have been more than this number of groups, but can I just take one more comment? Is that helpful? No? Yes? No? Yeah, some of you are looking like you would if you were just given a push. Another you going, and none of you is looking down and going, I'm never gonna say anything. It's not gonna happen for me. But Gary, you see, if you leave it long enough, the evangelist always wins out. Gary, unmute yourself, and I see that hand, but I cannot hear that voice. You have to unmute yourself. There you go. Gary, there we go.
Sorry, I was expecting you to. Hi. I'm sharing what someone else shared in our group, which really struck me and I thought relates very much to what you were saying about gathered and scattered. And that was that that his experience was that his church has moved out of the activity of church life into the living of the Christian life. And that for me was very significant. I thought that it obviously resonated with what you were saying to us, but it's also probably where we should be going, which we all, I suppose as pastors mostly, there's something we're so conscious of. And the danger of, I remember back in South Africa, one of the big things there was the walk, not a physical walk, but we used to talk about the Emmaus junkies. Some people were addicted. They lived on each of these events that happen twice a year. I don't know what they did in between times, but we can get lost. Christianity can get lost in the activity of the church, can't it? We missed the boat. So thank you to the guy who shared that. I thought that was profound in our group.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you. Thank you. It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think, you know, and again, everybody's context is different, but I'm assuming that for my worshipping congregation, we are not going to go back to worshipping together this year in the building. That is that's what I'm planning for, and that's what I'm preparing people for. I've had to do risk assessments on the building. To be honest, for us, it's just not going to be worthwhile. Our building is too small for the number of people that actually are in our congregation. And if you have to come back together again, you can't sing, and you have to use mass, and you can't greet each other, you can't take communion easily together, and you can't have tea and coffee afterwards, then in a sense, what's the point? So for us, we are now beginning to prepare the congregation that we're not going to go back quickly, even if you can go to Primark. So we're kind of preparing people in church to receive and understand ministry and to understand their own ministry differently, because I think this situation will push us within this. And it's quite interesting that, you know, you mentioned the tension of folks who are not technologically as savvy. And of course, that does cut across ages, doesn't it? I mean, in my church, I've got folks in their sort of late 50s, early 60s who are who don't seem to be able to switch on, and people in their mid to late 80s who are very adept at it. So it's not really an age thing. I think this is almost I don't know what it is, but anyway, it's not just an age thing. And it is knowing, well, how do your structures enable your whole congregations to minister? And I think as leaders, and I take Rob's point of, you know, we don't live in the ideal world. We've got tensions, and we've got people that we have that we're called to work with, who sometimes, you know, I think your phrase was less than helpful, and gracious phrase, and but that's almost like that's the cards we've been given, but we're still called to minister in a certain way. And I think that what we have got an opportunity to do is stop it all snapping back into the programmatic, building-oriented, paid staff focused way of ministry. But that does mean that people like me and you have to rethink our own ministry, because in some ways we've been house trained by our own congregations. They have discipled us into their culture as much as we have tried to drag them into a different culture. And the very real questions of things like funerals and who does those, and what is our role and what's the appropriate role. These are good questions to ask, but actually they underline much bigger questions. And remind me of when I was working on a very early initial pilot project with a Church of Scotland church plant in Greenock. And the guy there had decided early on that he would not do the wider community funerals, because he would have done 2 or 3 a week, and that with visitation would have taken all his time. And so he trained one of his lay folks to do the funerals and the pastoral, and the church grew because of it. And it was just him just going, in my context, I need to address this question rather than just do what everybody expects me to do because the Church of Scotland minister has already done this. And the other thing that he realized, of course, was that on the Greenock estates, most people didn't know what a minister's supposed to do anyway. So the fact that Liz was doing the services, well, they didn't actually know she wasn't a proper minister. Because it's like, if you don't know, you don't know. So it was almost like the internal pressure upon him was greater than the community pressure upon him. An anecdotal story from my own place. A couple of ladies called Pat and Shirley 20 years ago wanted to go into an old people's home to do some services, and they said to me, will you come and do these services? We did one at Easter, and then they said, will you come and do one of these services every week? And I said, no, but I'll train you to do them. And so they went in, and week by week they did 3 things. They made scones and took those in. They recorded some hymns on a cassette recorder and took those in, and then they gave a short little word. And they would gather anything between sort of 10 and 15 people in the lounge on a Tuesday afternoon. And then one of the residents died. Nothing to do with the scones. But one of the residents died. And the family said to Pat and Shirley, who were now in their mid-70s, would you do the service? Would you do the funeral? And Pat said, I'm not a proper minister. And the family said, you were to my mum. And so we trained them how to do, deal with the creme. And, how do you do a service and the buttons and all the other sort of stuff you've got to be aware of. And they did one, and then they did another, and then a member of staff died, and they did the funeral for them. And then 5 years passed, and then another family asked them to do it. And so these ladies now, who were in their early 80s, were doing funerals for people that they were ministering to. And the family were saying, you're the ones we want. Why would we want this guy, Neil, we don't know, when you knew our mum? And there's something about the way we see the opportunities for this. Now, I know it's easy for me to tell these stories because they're real stories. And you sit there and go, well, you don't know my situation, and it's true, I don't. But there's something actually about naming our own ministry. One of the things that Mark said was, or I think it was Mark, said that the danger of snapping back into the program and the running, keeping the show on the road, I think it was Rob's phrase. This is the difficulty, I think, for us as leaders in larger churches. Our task, the task we've been given, is to enable an organization, this sounds too blunt, but an organization to run really smoothly, to communicate, to establish processes, and to give vision to the church. That's our task. Our temptation is efficiency. It's what's expected of us, but the temptation of efficiency is you end up using people to do your job. So people become a resource. So the conversations, the unintended consequence of that is the conversations you have with people give them the impression that the organization is the main thing. So, anecdotal. After the church service and you're all mingling, people are mingling and having tea and coffee and all the rest of it. And you go up to someone and you go, good morning, how you doing? And they're not in need, and they know they're not particularly in need. And eventually they will ask you, what do you want? Now they'll ask it politely, but they will expect you to have targeted them because you need them to do something for you. Because that's actually how they see themselves. They're supporters of the ministry that's happening. And indeed, that's the temptation, isn't it, for all of us to, and again, this might tell you more about me than I would wish you to know, but you know that moment where someone's talking to you and you can see someone you really need to talk to about the running of the church, leaving the building, and that awful moment where you decide, can I get out of the conversation I'm in right now with this person because that person's leaving, and if I run down the path I'd get them, and if I don't see them today I'll not see them. And it's a temptation, and it's the unintended consequence. This is what I believe. I think we are called to run the organization. That is the truth. But I want to guard against the unintended consequences of that. People, and I know that none of you believe this, but people are not the resource to make it all happen. The ministry of the church needs to be as agile and as light on its feet in order that they can see that the ministry that they have is primarily where they are, not as a supporter of yours. And Mark, your comment was really interesting about, I'm paraphrasing, the church seems to be getting on quite well without me. This is a very alarming moment for anybody who's in ministry in a context where money's tight. But isn't that brilliant? They learn to love one another. They learn to minister to one another. They learn to keep in connection with one another. So what's your role now then? The truth that I know about myself is two things. These are two of the truths I know about myself. One, I have power. I have power within my own church context. And I've got to think about how I use the power and the authority I'm given. And most of the time, secondly, in lots of ways, I set the conversations. So the conversations I initiate with people determine the sort of ministry that people get and the vision I have. My task is to enable them to see themselves as participants in mission. Last night, I was having a one-to-one with a part-time staff member who looks after our young adults work. But he also works for Salford City Football Club, who are owned by Gary Neville, who you probably have heard of. And Gary has big plans for Salford City that they might become bigger than they are. And Andrew works for them. And my task with Andrew last night was to do two things, is to do the one-to-one line management of his role within the church. But my actual task with Andrew is to disciple him. That's my primary task. So in the line management of how are things going with young adults, that's a great conversation. It's a very important question for us to have so that he feels supported and accountable. But actually, in the terms of what does it mean for Andrew to be discipled, it was really important that Andrew could ask the question last night, at what point do I stand up when I think what's happening at the club goes against all the values I hold to be true? Now, that's the sort of question you want to be asked, isn't it? That's someone who's coming from a workplace saying, at what point do I stand up for what I think is right? And will you talk that through with me? Now, the reason Andrew does that, and Andrew's just around 30 years old, but the reason Andrew does that is because he has articulated on numerous occasions that he sees himself as the minister of Salford City Football Club. And he finds it a really awkward place to be in at times. And yet last night he said to me, the truth is, I know that if I left, there is no other Christian in that football club at the moment. So in a sense, he feels tied to the mast of the ship. He can't leave, but he wants to stand up for what's right and truth and justice. That at the end of the hour and a quarter of one-to-one last night was me going away going, that's the conversation I love to have. How do I enable people to see that they are not primarily supporters of the mission of the church, but they are participants in mission? And the biggest tool I have in my toolkit is I set conversations often. So last night in the one-to-one with Andrew, and I'm sorry for sort of banging on about it, but in the one-to-one with Andrew, if I'd only done the oversight of his task within the church, for which he's only paid for a fraction of his time, I would have reinforced the fact that our shared task in the church is the major thing about his life. Whereas actually for him, the major thing of his life is, how do I take a stand for truth and justice in a work context? Now, it's because of the way I set a conversation going and the questions I ask. I often don't have the answers, but I know really good questions determines the conversation that then provokes the imagination. I think the second thing is I've got to recognize my role and the task of the people who are part of the pastoral team, the pastoral care team, is to go from mere care to equipping. I've got to get people beyond offering sympathy to enabling people to see that in this context, with this situation, what is the potential for learning the way of Jesus? So So again, and these are all just anecdotal, but this is how it works out for me. So in my context, I had a call last Friday from a lady who's in her 70s, who's part of the pastoral team, and she is brilliant at staying in touch by the old-fashioned phone. She has a phone with a wire attached to it and a base that sits on a coffee table. And I haven't seen one of those for years, and she can't tell who's phoning her, and so she answers every phone call. And but she uses that to stay in contact with a whole stack of people, and she's brilliant. But on Friday, she said, "Can I talk to you?" And she had a problem with one of the small groups she belongs to, and she said, "But essentially, my problem is I'm deeply lonely, and because of the lockdown." And so we talked it through, and 7 years ago, her husband died, and the way she dealt with her grief was to become incredibly active. She joined every group going, and we could all see it. But the lockdown brought it home for her. And the conversation with her was really interesting, because this lady in her 70s, who I love her enormously, but it was, well, what are you learning about the way of Jesus here? What's Jesus teaching you here? The danger is, for someone like me, is I go into fix-it mode really quick. You're lonely? I've got a number of ways that you could address that. Whereas actually that's not, I mean, every man in the room should hear this and will have been told it many times. That's not what they're asking for. But that's my default mode. Whereas actually, as a leader of a disciple-making community, I need to disciple the people who are coming to me with the questions that they're asking. Very important for her. And then last one, and on Tuesday evening, one of the guys I meet once a month is not in leadership with me in church at all, but he was telling me about the day he'd had, and one of the things that had caused him enormous pressure was that the two cars in the family, they're Congolese family, and they've been in Salford for a number of years, but both of the cars that they bought, both of them have gone down the pan. Both of them have stopped working. Serious. And on the one level, it's that's a rubbish day, isn't it? For two cars. Your gearbox to go on one and your engine to go, that's a bad day. But gently and without crassness, trying to get him to explore, so what does this evoke in you on days like this? And he talked about being powerless, and he talked about the sense of being the man in the family and not knowing what to do next, and the feeling of being paralyzed. And then we talked about, well, actually, what would God teach you in the midst of this? And the danger is people quickly snapped up, oh, trust. Yeah. But it's like this, it's like the old-fashioned story, innit? It's got a bushy tail and it climbs trees and it eats nuts. Sounds like a squirrel, but the answer is probably Jesus. Everybody says trust. But no, come on, be more specific. Let's really work out what in this context does it mean to understand your maleness, your leadership, your place in society, all the other sort of stuff. That's my task, to move from care to equipping and to enable people who are in the pastoral care teams to do that. Now, not everybody will be able to do that. Some people will actually continue simply to offer the side-by-side care, the empathy, sympathy, and there's nothing wrong with that. We need people to do that. In the ideal world, we would do that to one another, love one another. That'd be the one anothering across the congregation. But we all know we need people who make sure nobody falls between the cracks to do that. But you need other people to ask the deeper questions, because actually it's in the moments of pain or crisis, and I'm not talking about major crisis, I'm just talking about my car's not working today crisis, that actually these become the moments for discipleship. And it's how do you have a conversation that feels natural in those things? And to be honest, I've got to model that if other people are going to be able to do it. Because unless they've gone through that, they won't know how to do it for other people. And then the third thing my task is to do is to enable people to move from niceness to being a disciple. Beyond niceness. Being a Christian is not about being nice. It's actually about knowing what it means to stand for the gospel. And on this, I'll just show one slide to in case you've not seen it. Sorry. Press wrong button. Some of you will have seen this slide before, but it was the reason that we, a number of years ago, did Fruitfulness on the Front Line, because actually people were asking, well, what do you mean by a disciple? What does a mission look like on the front line? And we came with what we recognized was that for those of us in church leadership, we knew, because we've been part of conversations for years about what it meant to move from mission to missional. In other words, that the whole of our engagement as a church would be missional, not just the occasional mission, not just proclamation. But what we hadn't done on the whole was given people a vision for their own lives and what would that look like. And that's why we came up with Fruitfulness on the Front Line. Now, some of you will have used that as a course, and it's a good course to do, and it raises good conversations. But the problem is it can just sound like another list of things for people to do, whereas actually in the ideal world, what you're doing is you're offering people a vision for their own lives. What does it mean to model godly character, the fruit of the Spirit? And in one sense, this sounds like motherhood and apple pie. But on the other hand, what does it look like? What does self-control look like in the context you find yourself in? What does it mean to make good work? What does a theology of work look like? It was in an Anglican church in the Northeast with a small group of people who were thinking about all of this for their own church, where a guy who was an Ofsted inspector, part of the PCC, part of the church all his life, and an Ofsted inspector for the local schools. Intelligent, well-connected, very confident, who said out loud, I never imagined that my faith and my work would ever have anything to do with each other, except that I would be a good person. Now, what's happened to him in church throughout 40 years that has meant that he's never understood a theology of work? The answer? No one's ever taught him. To minister grace and love, what does that look like? What does it mean to mold culture? And that was the question Andrew was asking me. When do I stand up and change the culture around here from a position when I'm not very powerful? What does it mean to be a mouthpiece for truth and justice? And indeed, what does it mean to be a messenger of the gospel? How do I find my voice? This becomes a vision for individual people. And it's a range. The first three take consistency. The first three, the character, the work, the grace and love, mean that actually you are what you say all the time. And the second three, they take courage. And I like the word courage better than confidence. People talk about being confident, but actually I like courage because lots of people don't feel confident, but lots of people need courage. And it's those three, consistency and courage. And it's not hard to imagine yourself thinking, well, actually, what needs to be emphasized in someone's context at this moment? I'm going to give you a moment. We're coming towards the end, but I'm just going to give you a moment. If there's things you want to push back on or ask about at this point, it might be helpful. Stephen.
Yeah, I found it extremely helpful, all of this. I just challenging you on the whole thing about care and equipping. There don't have to be intention. And a pastoral system that works extremely well, people have got that relationship with those folk, that actually they can do those challenging situations in a relationship that has been built up over many years.
Absolutely, Stephen. And really what I'm talking about, I agree completely. What I think is that pastoral equipping is fundamentally what pastoral care is about. Do you know what I mean? But I think what's happened is that pastoral care teams, which we've all got because of the size of our congregations, have defined for themselves often what pastoral care means. And what that often, even if we sort of tell them at the beginning, what it defaults to are, and this might be really unfair, and so if you go, it's not in my place, then that's great. But my fear is that without clear definition and training and support on an ongoing basis, what they become are nice people doing nice things for people who are in a difficult situation. So people feel well supported, but they miss the opportunity for the crisis to change them. And that's, if I'm right that a disciple is learning the way of Jesus in the context, then actually when two of your cars break on the same day and suddenly you feel crap as being a father and a husband and a man, if I don't actually engage with that conversation on that day, we miss an opportunity. Now that sounds too melodramatic, but that's, so I'm absolutely agreeing with Stephen. But what I'm saying is I think it defaults back, it snaps back to niceness if we're not careful. And I can see you agree. So Patrick, you put your hand up virtually.
Thank you, Neil. I think I agree, and I really feel pleased that I came in on this, because for me, thanks for your examples that you've given. One of the problems that brings pressure on us, that probably brings us to a place of forgetting that we are all participants in mission and taking charge of maybe pushing the enabling bit more or doing it ourselves, is contextual. I say this because, and we discussed it in our in our group of 4. Even with what is happening, one of the problems that beyond lockdown will be something to do with the body of Christ, if all of us are not coming back together. So I like your thought of not starting because all of us can't come. And I'm sure for most of us who've got elderly not come back, depending on what government or the connectional church says, that again is a worry. But how do we cater for them in terms of those who are able to come on the Zoom services and those who do not? But why I said it's contextual is the fact that in certain context that some of us are, it's an expectation just because of the multicultural nature, that even where pastoral visitors visit, even where another friend of the church had phoned to say, oh, how are you doing? I hope you're not feeling lonely. We are here for you and all of this. They want to hear from the minister. And that sometimes is not helpful.
Yeah. There's a number of points there that you made, and they're all valid. I think the expectations that people have of the minister's availability, and this has got to be an issue that you will have faced on many times and you will be addressing, because as leaders of larger churches, I'm not sure about this, but I'm suspecting that omnipresence is not one of the gifts of the Spirit that you've received. So they've had to come to terms with that. And depending on your own personality and your own way of working, you've probably addressed some of that along the way. I think and there's no easy answer, but the only thing I can say, and the only thing I try to practice, and I really do try to practice this, is to be fully present when I am with someone, so that even if I'm only with them, or even if it's only a 10-minute call, it's valuable. And if I'm really honest, I mean, I know this is being recorded, but in some ways, the situation we're in at the moment, where nobody expects you to visit because you can't, means that actually, if you call them and you have a 10-minute conversation with them on the phone, they feel delighted because they've not been forgotten, rightly so. You can speak something that's meaningful to them, and you can do 4 of those calls in an hour. I don't know if that sounds too blunt, but it's kind of, I'm ministering. I'm just ministering in a different way, and they feel really chuffed that I've contacted them, and they feel valued, and I want them to feel valued, because these people have been faithful to our church through the really rubbish days as well as the best days, and they're getting to the end of their life. And I know what I will, when I get to that sort of age, I want someone to go, Neil, we remember all you did for us and we don't take it for granted. And probably If someone calls me every now and again and says, just want to connect with you, see how you're doing, I won't expect to be on the phone for an hour, but I'll be chuffed that someone's called me. So part of my rhythm is, in my diary, is making sure that there's time to do that. And I've not got as many people as some of you have. Some of you are dealing with many more people than I am. But with 180, I can do that. Because I can do it both systematically, just go through the church book. Eugene Peterson said the two most important books on a pastor's table are the Bible and the church directory. The Bible so you can hear from God, and the church directory so you can pray for your church. And I can do that systematically, but I can also do it because I can be alert. And what I think are the nudges of the Spirit. I just get, you need to call this person. Now, sometimes the nudges of the Spirit are just from God, and sometimes they're from my wife, but both of them are often quite accurate. And this lockdown period enables me, and if we're right about this, and this is going to go on at least until the end of the year, and for our eldest people, this will be until a vaccine is found, then I can establish new patterns of working for myself and expectations of them. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's what I'm trying to do. Anybody else? We've got 2-3 minutes. Okay. I have suggested that that we might meet again if you would wish. On the original email that was my fault, I suggested a Saturday morning, and then when I reread what I'd written to Emma and Emma had accepted without any pushback, I thought, what was I thinking? So I would want to suggest, I don't know what I was thinking, just the inability to read a calendar I think is the problem. But what I would like to suggest, if possible, that we meet on the Thursday the 9th of July at the same time, if it's helpful to you. Rather than Saturday morning, which was the original email. I'm sure that Emma will email that out again to you, but that's my suggestion. But what I would find helpful, if you can, before we close in a couple of minutes, is if you could, on the chat facility, could you answer one? Could you answer one of these questions? Just on the chat facility, can you answer one of those questions? And there's not particularly time, you can answer all three if you wish, but there's not particularly time for that. But I wonder whether that would be helpful to me. So what have you been reminded of? What's new, if anything? And what's worth repeating? In other words, what have you heard that you would want to repeat to someone else in your team or in your church context? As opposed to what have you heard that you would like me to say again, which would be a strange thing to ask. What have you heard that's worth repeating to someone else? And as you're doing that, and as you've done that, I'm going to hand back to Emma. I think I'm handing back to Emma or Tony, who will wrap our time up together. Thank you.
Neil, thank you very much for the time you've spent with us and for all you've shared, particularly having shared from your own pastoral experience. I think we really are looking forward to the continuation of this session next time. So thank you very much. Blessings, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.
Thanks for all that you're writing. I really appreciate that. And perhaps I can just pray, and then when you're ready, then of course you're free to leave. Lord, I thank you that there was a day when you called us into your service, and the area you called us into was to serve the church, that others might get a vision for their life, for the mission of the kingdom, and that we would see people's lives being transformed by the gospel. And Lord, we recognize that in our own lives, you've changed us over the years so much. And we keep learning and being reminded and being recalled to the call you gave us. Lord, I pray for each of us in our own context. You know they are so different. But Lord, I pray for us in our context that we ourselves as individuals will learn the way of Jesus. The Lord, in these days, in our places, with our people and our joys and our challenges, that we will learn the way of Jesus. And I pray that as we do that, so Lord, we will be able to share a vision for what life is like and what the church means in these days. Give us courage, give us wisdom, give us insight. And Lord, we pray blessing upon our congregation scattered across the country, literally, today. We pray for wherever they may be, the context that they find themselves in, that they will serve you well and serve you faithfully and be blessed. Lord, may your hand rest on us, we pray, in the name of Jesus. Amen. Thank you very much, and thanks for your comments. I'll keep those. But if there's anything else you want to write or you want to contact me, then please do so through Emma or Tony. But I do hope I can meet you next time as well. All right, bless you. Thank you. At this time, you would normally in person erupt into rapturous applause. I'll just assume that's already happened. Thanks ever so much. Have a great day.